That's good.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Could you? It's the one with the short hair.
Blue shirt.
Blue shirt. Yeah. Okay, perfect. I think we're good to go.
Oh, yeah. Huh? No, no.
Oh.
I mean, yeah, I am.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, it should be fine like this.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. And now that we are closed in this room, welcome to Utrecht University. Welcome to this panel on human rights, higher education. My name is Anton Wijs, Director of CITI, which is the Dutch abbreviation for the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights at this university. I'm very happy to welcome you on behalf of both CIM and the Dutch Soroctonists who are together organizing this event. Welcome also to those watching the live stream, as well as, of course, you came to be here with us today. Both the Soroctonists, summer school participants, students, colleagues, and their panelists to have you here. Why are we here today? Not just to discuss the content. The impetus for this is a special occasion. That is the renewal of the chair of Human Rights Education, which is held by my dear colleague, Dr. Lisa Tibbets, who is also the Unesco chair. And this chair is special and dear to us in many ways. But one of them is that this is a chair which is supported finance and has been created by a group of committed citizens, namely the Dutch Soroctonists. And so it is very rare because it's usually big companies or institutions that sponsor chairs at universities. But very rare that it's a group of citizens. So thanks again to the Soroctonists for this great collaboration over all the years, and with the renewal of the chair, this will continue. And I quickly pass on the chair to Professor Tibbets to further introduce the afternoon.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for taking the time to come to this panel today and our discussion on human rights in higher education. It has been a real honor and pleasure to be the chair of human rights education at CIM, and I'm very grateful for the chair being renewed by Utrecht University and by the Seroptimus, and look forward to another, I guess at this point, another 4.5 years in this position. The core mandate of my chair is human rights in higher education, and hence the idea to organize this panel on the occasion of my reappointment. And I'd like to say a few things about human rights and higher education before introducing the panelists and moving on. I propose that higher education institutions can be seen as human rights actors. And I think there's two ways to justify that. On the one hand, universities, many of them are public institutions, and therefore they're representing government and obligated therefore to uphold international human rights standards. However, even private universities have obligations to abide by higher education national systems of regulation, and many times higher education faculty and students also receive funding from the government. And for this reason, I think we can argue that that higher education institutions can be seen as duty bearers and also obligated to uphold international legal and normative standards in human rights. Another reason I think to think about higher education and human rights is that higher education is both a private good, meaning that those of you who are undertaking your university degrees expect to benefit from careers, maybe your incomes, depending on those of you, what area you choose to go into. But it's also a public good. It's a public good because universities have impacts on societies, not only through economic development, this idea that you have a better educated population and you increase economic development, but also because it's a public good that that universities have a role to play in promoting civic engagement, social justice, social cohesion. So with these in mind, this panel is thinking to the larger question about higher education and human rights. If we agree that higher education institutions can be seen as human rights actors, how can we enhance the power of human rights in the university setting? What are opportunities and what are the challenges we face? And those are exactly the questions that our truly prestigious panelists will be addressing today. The process is that I'm going to ask a couple of questions to the panelists. They've heard the questions already, and they will we'll go 2 rounds, briefly respond. After they respond, we'll have a question and answer. So there will be an opportunity to share or ask questions, you in the audience. And afterwards, we're going to have a wonderful reception at the Academy Cabal, funded by the Seroptimus. And so I'm already inviting you to join us for that if you haven't already planned to do so. I'd like to now briefly introduce each of the panelists, and this will also be the order in which I invite you to respond to the questions so that we sort of know the order it's going in. All right. So Dr. Alexandra Timmer, to my right, is Associate Professor of Human Rights at Utrecht University, so associated with SIN. Her research focuses on equality and non-discrimination. She's also chair of the Utrecht University Law, Economics, and Governance faculty's Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. So she is wearing sort of 2 hats today, if you will. Dr. Yvonne Donters at the end of the table is Professor of International Human Rights at the University of Amsterdam and head of the Department of International and European Law. She is commissioner for the time being at the Netherlands National Human Rights Institute. She was just recently elected member of the UN Human Rights Committee, a very impressive and prestigious role. Congratulations to you. She'll begin that work in January. We also have Dr. Fatima Zahra Derich. She is to the right, to the left of Professor Dominers. and she is the CEO of the Stichting voor Vluchtelingstudenten UAF Foundation for Refugee Students. This organization, which you may already have heard of, provides support for refugee students and professionals in their studies and in finding suitable employment in the Netherlands. The UAF reports obstacles, defends refugees' interests, and collaborates with educational institutions, employees, employers, and local governments to create equal opportunities for refugees. And then we also have our only male on the panel. I'm not sure how that happened, but very happy that you're here. Dr. Johan Verriet. He is the senior advisor of the Netherlands Commission for Unesco. He supports the National Commission in making sure everyone in the Netherlands and abroad benefits from scientific advancements. He will elaborate on his work, I'm sure, in his answer to the panelist questions. And I also would like to congratulate him for recently defending his dissertation on the history of health promotion at the Radboud University. Congratulations, Dr. Verriet. Very, very happy for you. So those are our panelists for today. I'd like to now just move to our first question and invite each of the panelists up to 5 minutes to respond. I'm so sorry it's so short, but I'll let you know, I guess 5 minutes is up. So the first question, reflecting on your respective efforts and organizations that you are representing, how would you describe your engagement with human rights and higher education? And what are the impacts you see in terms of learning about and actually activating for human rights?
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this lovely panel and for posing this question in such a scientific manner. Well, so I struggle a bit because I have two hats, as you already mentioned. I'm a researcher most, but also for officially 2 hours in a week, de facto more, chair governance. And so in that last capacity, sitting here on this panel. So equality, diversity, inclusion is a full mouth. From now on, you want to call it 80. Sounds like your best friend, you know, 80. So what does this committee do? You might wonder. So our purpose is to integrate diversity inclusion in all the primary processes of the university. And there are 3 primary processes really: teaching, research, and institutional matters, including everything to do with organization, HR issues. And we look at EDI on different grounds, so in different dimensions. We're talking about gender issues and cultural, ethnic, and religious background, disability, sexual orientation and gender identity, and age. And then we're looking both at the students' experience and also the employees of the university. So that's quite a mandate. It's quite broad. And your question actually triggered me to reflect on the human rights component. And you think it's obvious because it's researcher, but actually I haven't really connected the dots so far yet. And I started with checking our strategy and action plan. Our real five to work from. And the words human rights don't appear in that strategy and action. I am not so sure, however, that is problematic. Because even though perhaps the work on equality, diversity, and inclusion is not always framed in terms of human rights, I do think that in many ways it is through this strategy, the university, and through the work of the AD committee, the university does strive to enhance human rights. And it's a way, I'm not saying it's the only way, but it is a part of human rights work that this university does. Now, my own strategy as chair of this committee is to turn equality, diversity, and inclusion into something positive. I am well aware that this deeply ideologically tested terrain. And if you read the newspapers in the Netherlands, practically every day you see something related to this topic. and the many problems that there are in society, institutions, including universities, concerning a lack of diversity, a lack of equality, and a lack of inclusion. But as chair of this committee, and with my institutional hat on, I don't think it is my role or my committee's role to enter very deeply in those debates all the time. It doesn't mean to say that we should be naive or not realize what the field that we're working in, but I think we also have to be pragmatic. I already said, no, I have 2 hours for that. That is also the reality for everybody on this committee. It's something that we do on the side. There are only very few people within the university being able to work full time on this. Well, there are a few. There is an office, more or less 5 members of full-time staff. So I'm learning to be pragmatic, which is not my my comfort zone. And usually, as the researcher, I love debating and deconstructing and saying that that's the concept, and I love teaching students about this. But in this committee, we're more practical. So I could give you several examples of what we're doing. Different levels. Some things are more on the symbolic level. Think about the language that we use, for example, whether it's inclusive. Perhaps you see the beautiful rainbow path that goes through this landscape, which is in a way symbolic, but it's meant to make visible something. But other things are much more concrete and relate to actual entitlements. Just to give you an example now of my daily work, where I'm pushing for better parental leave regulation for people with teaching English. What we know from Corona, for example, is that, surprise, surprise, long care work disproportionately again fell down to women. And so we're looking at whether we can improve, people with most teaching. Also for the men, by the way, thinking behind this is suffered lots in terms of their ability to do research. So that's something very concrete. Another thing that we're working on is to make the appointments to committees within the university, research committees, teaching committees, we have lots of committees, and to make the process of appointment to these committees more transparent, so that it's not just how you get invited in by somebody, but that everybody, well, the appointment committees work in different ways, but we're trying to support the process, making it more transparent. I'll stop here. I do also have ideas for the future. Hopefully we'll be able to come next round.
Thank you very much. Great to be here, and congratulations to Utrecht for the renewal of this wonderful chair. I was at the start of it actually when we had our first conversations. I'm really glad to see that, because let's face it, it's not so obvious to have a chair in human rights education at university. Many people might consider human rights education as something of young people, right? Juniors, pupils, young people, and of course, that's certainly also important. But what I find so interesting and important about this particular chair is that you show this lifelong learning also goes at universities, and that actually human rights education is very important. And I would like to sort of add on to our where Alexandra left off, in the sense of it's a bit about practice what you preach, because there's different ways of doing this. And I also am here with 2 hats on. I will say something about the National Human Rights Institute of the Netherlands and its work on human rights education, but of course I'm also professor and teacher at the university. And I teach human rights. So for me, human rights education is literally what I do. But actually, I think the power lies in parts where there's no human rights courses, and also parts of the university where it's not so logical to think about human rights. For instance, the natural sciences, the thinking. I mean, think of other parts, the other disciplines in universities where speaking of values, speaking of human rights is not so obvious. And I think, just to kick off a little bit also the second part, this is one of the challenges that we face. Now, let me first go back to the National Human Rights Institute, het College voor de Rechten van Mens. Also working closely together with Zon op de Mist, by the way. The national institutes are in almost every country, but they're very different. So I also invite every one of you not coming from the Netherlands to look up what your Human Rights Institute is doing, what it is, where it is, and what it does. Because it's quite different. So what I tell here might not completely apply or differently apply in a particular country. So here the Netherlands Institute has a clear mandate. It's in the law that established the National Institute that we have to promote human rights education in schools, unfortunately, I would say. But we took that a bit more broadly and said, okay, it's not only schools and schools are relative, etc. So we try to enlarge our mandate a bit and to include, for instance, also human rights education for professionals, for professional groups. And then you can think again about perhaps that are encountering human rights issues quite often, like the police, the military, etc. But we also try to work with people working in the human resource department of companies. Because as Alexandra was saying, selection processes are important human rights angles, actually, of what you actually are doing in your organization. But to be honest, the National Institute doesn't do a lot with universities and human rights education. It's a matter of prioritization, lack of budget, etc. But that would be the easy answer. I think also in the National Institute, the sort of awareness of the importance of different groups and different age groups in terms of human rights education, that there can be something improved there. We also struggle in the Institute with what is actually human rights education. Now, of course, Felisa knows very well, because this is her chair, she can explain extremely well what human rights education is. But for an institute with a mandate to promote human rights in the Netherlands, it's certainly certain things, but also is, for instance, information to the general public. Is that considered to be also a form of human rights education? Or should there be some form of interaction before we can actually call it human rights education? Is it indeed part of what should we do as an institute to promote human rights education? And of course, since the institute is also doing a lot of policy advice and legal advice, we are closely involved on another part of human rights education, or link with human rights education, and citizenship education. And I also still struggle sort of in explaining what the differences are, etc. Not to get into details today about this, but it is something that of course makes sometimes the discussion a bit fuzzy. That people are not so much aware of what are we actually talking about. What I find important is that we should at least move, and this is also for the university, so here I made the connection, we should move beyond the legal documents and instruments on human rights. Human rights education is as much about knowing what your rights are, knowing what the rights of other people are, but it's also very much about human rights principles and to apply those in your daily work, daily life, the way you deal with people. So again, things such as inclusion, participation, but also attention for disadvantaged groups, for instance, is very important. Universities still have a lot to do for persons with disabilities, for instance, to make that form of education more accessible. And the same goes, of course, for companies and workplaces. So it's not only about memorizing the Universal Declaration and knowing exactly what is in Article 18 and 20 or whatever, and what we teach our students also to do. But for me, it's much broader than that. In universities, if you call them indeed human rights actors, should, what I said, practice what they preach, but also see it in a broader perspective of applying the human rights principles that are behind all these legal instruments. It's not only about claiming rights, it's really how do we want to teach each other, how do we want to educate with each other. And universities are excellent places to do this. We have international classrooms nowadays, we have a variety of people in rooms, but that also brings challenges, which we will deal with in the second part of this conversation. But it also gives us a lot of opportunities to share views, to share ideas, to listen to each other, and also to learn from each other. And the second point that I wanted to make is what I find important to preach, so to say, is that human rights are not static. Human rights are, again, going beyond the legal, the legal interpretation of these rights. they're not static. They have to move also with how societies go. They have to be able to adjust themselves to current issues, to current topics. Maybe things that we didn't think of 50 years ago when we adopted all of these instruments. Think about the internet, privacy issues, think about climate change and how to deal with that from a human rights perspective. So again, coming back to where I started, this in my view implies that we shouldn't only teach human rights. Of course, it's part of our curriculum, several other curriculum, but that we also should make sure that in the university, human rights is one of the fundamental issues, fundamentals that shows us, that makes our teaching the way we want it to be. And that is when you put them at the bottom, at the foundation of actually your education. Now, the National Human Rights Institute, as I say, plays a rather modest role, I have to say, in this endeavor. But I hope, at least with all of the people here, that we can make best out of this, because it's really something that has been ignored for quite a while. Thank you.
First, I wanted to say that I'm quite honored being a companion of these people. And just to correct myself, I'm not a doctor for people who go this. It's nice to be one day. Just to also, before I begin with my own story, I have worked with human rights a lot. So one of my motivations to start as a director of the UIF was because it is also human rights workers. So the first day when I started my job, people were asking me like, why? What is your motivation? I said, yeah, human rights. They were looking at me, those are my colleagues. Human rights, what are you talking about? And I said, do you know the statutes of our company, the organization? Its foundation is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 75 years ago, next year, in 1948, it was established here in Utrecht at the Jaarbeurs, where 2,000 scholars and students who wanted to support Czech and Slovakian refugee students who came to the Netherlands and who wanted to continue their studies. And also at that time, the declaration was being drafted. In December, it would be adopted by the General Assembly. So it's very important also for the UIF that there is a link to human rights. And then I had human rights things. Didn't know like the basis of higher education. So I know there is a basis for education until the age of 18. But we couldn't find one exactly for higher education. So people were asking me, like, how could there be then this connection to the university? I said, the basis is that human rights is important for us to strive for this equality and to also strive for long and life education, which is now also an SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, number 4. And for me also the SDGs is like a connection with the human rights. So it's very important also to take that into account. And if people, refugee students, if they come to the Netherlands under the Refugee Convention, Dutch government is obliged to give them a safe haven, but also a sustainable life. And how can you get a sustainable life without good education? So we as the UIF, we help students to continue the higher education, but also to start new ones. And what we find also with our universities, our partners, is that the will is there, but there's also sometimes obstacles. Also what you said, there are sometimes obstacles made by the government with the integration law, which I will not discuss with you right now, but there is an obstacle there. But also within the universities itself, because you have to imagine sometimes it's difficult for a student who was, for example, studying in Syria or Iraq, who has a certain education level in their home country, but here, when the evaluation starts by nothing, for example, it isn't sometimes graded at the same level. So the student has sometimes to begin all over again, or when demotivated, start something else. So for us, it's really important to see how we can support these students to begin new studies, to see and develop themselves, and also to live their dreams and their ambitions. Sometimes I get a question like that, follow studies, they can get jobs in the tight labor market in the Netherlands. And then I say, do the same with our Dutch youth. We tell them, live your dream and study what you want. Another example, for example, Jelly, for example, is you also mentioned it, is inclusion and equality. Equality is an important human right also, but sometimes refugee students, they have more obstacles because they are not treated equally. For example, if a foreign student comes to the Netherlands, he or she has another different background than a refugee student, but here at the university admissions bureau, they treat them the same. And that's not fair, because how can you treat somebody who had a long travel with traumatic experience, has to settle here and start from the beginning? You have to see how you can level and change the entrance level. I'm not saying to lower, I'm just saying to take into account what this individual has experienced. And also for another solution could, for example, be is when you have dyslexia in the Netherlands, you get half an hour more or an hour, I don't know exactly. Why don't we do some things like this also for these refugees? So equality and inclusion is an important issue also for refugee students to be successful in the Netherlands. And to have a successful education and to finish it is also important to integrate well in that society and to find a good job, to have a sustainable life together with you and your sometimes their families. So it's very important to take that into account. And what we also try to do is we are actually also the advocates of refugee students, but also refugee professionals to help them find their jobs. So what we do is also to signal the challenges and the thresholds that these people experience and to put them on the agenda, and also to talk with our political leaders and also the government to try to see how we can solve these issues. So I'm going to
Hi. So first off, I want to thank Felisa for the invitation, and I want to say I'm honored, and I have to say also a little bit humbled to be part of this panel. But I'll say a couple of things from my vantage point. So UNESCO is the United Nations organization that uses education, culture, and science to foster understanding between people and to promote peace. And so science is not just one of UNESCO's pillars, you might say, but UNESCO also promotes a human rights approach to science, and that's sort of the way I want to approach it today. So this means that you often see on discussions within UNESCO, and when UNESCO talks about science outward as well, that it quotes the Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and especially the famous Article 27, where it says that it's a human right for every person to share in the benefits of scientific advancements. So now there are several ways UNESCO tries to operationalize this approach. Both in the Netherlands, so I'm an advisor to the Dutch Commission for UNESCO, but also abroad, also internationally. And because, for instance, UNESCO is committed to non-discrimination, we have an international program, but a Dutch program as well, which is called For Women in Science, and it is aimed at helping women, and it has already sort of been mentioned by Alexandra before, especially women in a phase in their academic career where a lot of women, especially in the Netherlands, sort of move away from academia because the division of labor is so gendered in the Netherlands. So they often struggle in this period, let's say in their 20s and in their 30s, because of the sort of bias in how we divide work. And so these are fellowships and grants which help these relatively young academics to sort of get a leg up, to develop their career further. And that's part of sort of UNESCO's idea that identity should in no way be an impediment to access to higher education, of course, but also to having a career in academia. And the second, so as you can already sort of hear, it's UNESCO tries to sort of very practically operationalize these very lofty and big ideas. And the second way UNESCO does that is by promoting open science. And I think open science is also very much related to this idea that science should be not just a common good, but in a way, access to science is a human right. And that makes open science, so the open sharing of information, of data by scientists, sort of a very important condition for making science a human right. So last year there was a recommendation on open science, and it was signed by all the 193 member states of UNESCO, and they were again they sort of try to stress the importance of bridging the gap between citizens and scientists. So open science can be a way where we involve not just a couple of people, but all communities and all over the world in the scientific process, and not just communicate scientific results to them, but help them really get involved in the scientific process. And in the Netherlands, I think the Netherlands mission to UNESCO is always looking as well to not just to support inventive science communication, but especially to also support citizen science initiatives where citizens can actually, from sort of bottom up, can participate in the scientific process. And the third way, it's the last I'll say for now, is of course the UNESCO chairs, of which Belisa is one, of course, and we actually have even a second chair in the Netherlands, the UNESCO chair in human rights at Maastricht University. And these chairs, there's almost 900 in the entire world, and these chairs are a way for UNESCO to sort of create a global network and to promote inclusive scientific processes and practices, and also to help build a sustainable future. And I think the chairs, although I do have to mention, of course, that they are usually primarily financially supported by their institutions, but UNESCO sort of offers them a network and offers them the opportunity to start new interesting partnerships and to reach a broader audience. So that's what I'll say.
Thank you so much. I'll ask you then your next question, and this one wants to respond, so good luck with that. So very different answers, very interesting, some connection to inclusivity. Part of the reason for inviting you is because you all are really based in different institutions with different ways of identifying human rights as relevant explicitly work. So given what each of you said, looking ahead, what opportunities, what possibilities do you see for strengthening the role of the university specifically as a human rights actor in society? What would your advice be?
Now, when it comes to equality, diversity, and inclusion, it is on the agenda at business universities and other institutions. So we go, for the most part, fight for that. Thanks to participation, thanks to Black Lives Matter, it is on the agenda. Now the question is, what do you do once it's there? In some sense, the real work is only beginning then. Now, problems, lack of equality, lack of diversity, lack of inclusion are everywhere in the Yvonne already mentioned that mainstreaming in all the disciplines and in all the actions that one obstacle I've so far observed is the shyness to act. What we Dutch word handelingsverleden. People are sensitive, yeah. So we're shy to act. We have going to there. And should stop it. A better world starts with ourselves now. Make the real thing by yourself. So that's to take away that shyness acts we see as a major goal of people like us who work institutions. And how do you take away the shyness to act? By acting. Yeah, we're not going to get it right. Certainly not going to be perfect. But doing something is doing better than nothing. So that's point one, and that's action. Not just for women, also within university, but also strategy. We give you examples now. This university, these two things, acting now as action, I think already going all the way towards solving some.
Thank you. I think universities, how can they strengthen themselves as human rights actors? Is first of all by seeing themselves as human rights actors, and I don't think many of them see themselves as such. They see themselves as educational facilities, and just as much as you were surprised that your colleagues said, "What is that?" Rights, I think a lot of our colleagues, not working in law or human rights or particular fields, might also say, "What university, a human rights actor? What does that mean?" So I think there's a lot to do there. And the nice thing about university is you have all the platform that you need, because it is a platform of exchange, it's a platform of freedom of expression, it's a platform of education. So educate others and educate yourself, I would say, in the sense of, on the one hand, promote the teaching of human rights, the information of human rights, and on the other hand, emphasizing practice, what you preach, and educate yourself. I do see challenges as well. We see that, for instance, in the last couple of years, linking also a bit to, say, the challenge for scientists to indeed take part in a public debate, for instance, on human rights issues, is getting more and more difficult. They get threats, they get, harassment, all kinds of things. So a free exchange and a free participation is an increasing challenging exercise, whereby a lot of scientists actually refrain themselves from taking part in a public debate, and especially on human rights. I think that's an absolute shame. And as I said, I think the idea of it's showing people how important it is to embrace human rights, not so much as something you teach, because not every faculty, not every discipline does that necessarily, but as something that can enhance your own work as a scientist, as a researcher, as an educator and teacher. I think that should certainly help everyone.
I actually wanted to say partly the same thing about speaking out. And recently there was an article in Dutch Financial Times, which also some scholars, they spoke out, and it's quite difficult sometimes to speak out. And regarding the work that we do, we work together with universities, with also umbrella organizations, but sometimes we see that they are afraid to speak out, not only because of the unsafe atmosphere, but also because the conflict of interest sometimes with the government. So what we would also like to see to be more activist, not in a negative way, but in a positive way, to also stand up in the debate, for example, regarding the refugee crisis and the refugee issues that are now at hand in the Netherlands. Another issue that I would also like to see more participation, and you said, Alexander, already you are doing a lot. We was also in Utrecht University have this inclusion program, which we are very much appreciated, and also for other universities or companies. So we are looking into how to promote that. But another issue is scholars. You see that scholars who are refugees, it's quite difficult for them to get access to Dutch academia. And it's also because they have a gap in their resumes, but also that their level is seen to be, taken into that. Also just to have a conversation. And I really would like to see more accessibility for scholars who are refugees. Another issue is what the students and the universities can do. We have this budget system, which is very good. What we see is that students who begin it's quite difficult for them to get admitted within the student society in the Netherlands. And can you imagine, you have traveled months maybe, and you come here, you start building your life, and then language well, and you sit here in one of these seats and you look around, you don't know what or how, what to say. And we see, a percentage of our clients also dropping out because they're insecure, they don't have their peers. So it would be great also to have fellow refugee students, also Dutch students, to be their environments and just to help them and support them.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we maybe should have shared notes beforehand, because I also wrote down that we should take care of our own first. And by that I mean that if scientists are threatened, then science can't really be safe, and it can't be if they can't freely do their work, then they can also not really promote human rights in any way, if their own human rights are threatened. So I'll reiterate that, and I'll add that I think it's especially relevant because, as I mentioned before, if participation in science and sharing the benefits of science is a human right, then we need scientists to get out there. And if they don't feel safe to get out there, then that's a big problem. I do think that there is a big professionalization right now, especially in the Netherlands, in science communication, which is pretty exciting. But there's a challenge there as well, where I think sometimes institutions don't yet recognize and reward those types of CVs yet. So scientists aren't rewarded and recognized for the sort of work they do in reaching out. And I think we can still do more to sort of be accepting of different types of academic careers. So maybe there's someone who's a little less focused on publishing in peer-reviewed journals, but is doing the work in getting out there and promoting, for instance, human rights. Then I think we also need to work, the institutions can do more to support those kinds of careers as well. But generally I'm optimistic, maybe because my work consists of talking to ambitious and idealistic people most of the time. But I think also there are signs. There was a survey by the Rathenau Institute where last year they found that, at least in the Netherlands, trust in science is fairly high and fairly stable. So I think people are generally eager to be informed by scientists and to engage with science. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. A lot to think about. That each of you in some ways found some connections here with the comments that were raised. I just want to make a brief comment, and then we're going to open it up for discussion, questions, comments for the panelists. I do agree with you, Yvonne, that there's a lot of potential for universities to self-identify more as human rights actors. That's obviously coming from someone who's committed to human rights and higher education. And I think that the thinking is moving in that direction. That the so-called human rights-based approach, for example, which is now being applied in development organizations and other entities, can also be applied in higher education. And I think many of the points that were raised by panelists here touch on that: accessibility, inclusion inside of higher education institutions, safety of academics, encouraging them to be public commentators, for example, and also teaching, of course. So the rights-based approach to higher education, I think, is the future of a way of framing this and putting it together, and hopefully we'll see more of that literature in the future. I now want to open it up for all of you. Actually, feel free to do so. Anita, if you may give us this. Great, okay. So I'm going to pass the line first here. I see 3 hands. So let me start. And then here. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My name is Somali Dekwan. I'm a Dutchified Iranian and alumna of University College Utrecht and Utrecht University, and currently a PhD candidate at the School of Management. Set the credentials when I asked about UNESCO and the Human Rights Declaration that was set in 1949. In 1999, UNESCO commissioned a group of 150 scientists and actors in the civil society internationally to come up with a new declaration, which they called it Human Responsibilities and Duties. And it was declined by UN itself. And throughout this whole discussion, we just talk about human rights, that we should teach human rights. What about human responsibility? Our farmers do have the right to protest, but what about their responsibility for making the children of our ministers feeling fear at the safety of their own home, or blocking the roads and making it impossible for people to go to work, or distribution centers and so on? What about teaching rights and responsibility as a combination inseparable and must have together in order to make sense of the freedom that we have and the responsibility that we have towards our society? Of course, representing UNESCO are also continuously refer to human rights, and I would like to know, where do we get into talking about responsibility?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for that excellent question. I agree, of course, that but I think also that any discussion about human rights is a discussion about responsibilities. And I would say, in the example you give, that there is also the question whether someone's human rights are being exercised while someone else's human rights are being trampled. So it's also, I do wonder if that's a discussion about responsibility, or even just a discussion about weighing different human rights in relation to each other. But I agree, of course, that any discussion about human rights needs to be about responsibility as well. I am not in this sense, a representative of UNESCO where I say everything that UNESCO does, I personally agree or disagree with. But in this case, I am pretty fond of the idea that a discussion about rights should be primarily a discussion about rights, but then we should talk about responsibilities as well.
Sorry, Stanley. I completely agree. I mean, my rights end where yours begin, to say it in simple terms. I mean, almost no human right is unlimited, to be enjoyed unlimitedly. So of course, there's always has to be a balance found between the rights of one and the rights of others. And that means that in enjoying your rights, you have to take into account that other people have rights as well, and how you do that. And I think you rightly brought this up, because we sort of, no, not ignored, but didn't pay attention enough to it. That is exactly also where I like the idea that universities are these human rights actors, provide that platform. Because I say it now very simply, but when it comes to concrete cases and the balancing of different rights with each other and responsibilities or duties or whatever you call it, it becomes quite complex. There's lots of dilemmas actually faced when you do that kind of exercise. But I think universities, with the people that are in there, are the excellent platforms to have such a conversation in. But you're right, it has to be done.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Mirjana. I come from Bulgaria, a little bit of international experience here. I'm a one-year-old government agent at the Ministry of Justice, previously 20 years in the NGO world, so quite a lot of still feeling like wearing quite a lot of hats. We in the government agent's office are implementing a project very similar to what is talked about here. It's a predefined Norway financed project on a lot of with a very important component of promoting human rights education, both horizontally and vertically in universities. We recently did a big publicity event at the largest private university in our country, where we had the honor and pleasure of welcoming Professor Gibbons, although distantly by his soul. So it's a struggle. It's a struggle. We are quite we are at a different stage of from what you are talking about. It's a struggle like convincing conservative, because educational system is conservative. Convincing a conservative system with conservative factors that human rights are important, that teaching human rights to future lawyers, both horizontally from different, both horizontally as a separate subject and vertically from an is an important matter, because those are tomorrow's professionals which should be applying human rights concepts throughout their work. It's like everywhere where people work, it's also a personality struggle, because I think that Professor Tibbets attended, we officially heard that because Professor X, Y, and Z were there, other professors X, Y, and Z did not count. So, but so we have mandate to promote, we need sanction mandate to promote human rights. We are not just another banging on the table. You should be teaching human rights. So people kind of listen to us, but it's still a long struggle, which we are determined to continue. And thanks very much to the panelists of contributing to my, and from that to our inspiration to continue that struggle. Thank you.
You have somebody and then
Hi, maybe a bit of a more breadth. I was wondering if you guys have seen a shift or a change in engagement in human rights education, people who want to follow education. I work at MST and organize human rights education for students there. And yeah, on the one hand, I see that people are more interested in things like protests and social issues. But on the other hand, there's a new sort of passiveness. People are not willing to connect or stay connected, or even show up for something, whether it is something educational or volunteering or action. Yeah, I wonder if that's something you recognize and are being used.
Okay. I think one of the challenges of human rights education is that it has to constantly be relevant to what's happening in society. And without it being relevant, you risk it being, style reduced to legal standards, normative standards. And because I think human rights education, whether that's happening in university, or whatever level of schooling, if you are connecting it up with issues that are relevant, especially learners care about, then you always have space for it. I mean, there's one question is that I could answer, which is, what about the status of human rights education and curriculum policy? And I can say that I can't speak for universities, but I can say that generally speaking, internationally, there's only a trend upwards presence of human rights in curriculum. There's research that shows that. Maybe that's going to be changing because of a regression in human rights in the last years, but there had been until recently kind of increased presence of at least the themes, the mention of human rights, which doesn't speak to how it's being taught, if the praxis, if it's encouraging activism, if it's relevant. But the potential when you have the frame of human rights is that you can link it up. I recently, in not only in the United States where I'm based, but in many other countries, there have been a lot of youth activists we know going to the streets in very inspiring ways, for example, around climate change.
And I recently started to have conversations with youth activists, very involved, and asked them, is human rights relevant to you? So I sort of found activists and asked them, is the language relevant for you? I don't see that language being used in the climate justice movement. And every youth that I've spoken with have said, absolutely. Because those who are affected most by climate change are those who are most vulnerable. There's a lot of intersectionality here around who's most affected by climate change, and the human rights frame fits, even if they're not using it. So I think the challenge is to stay relevant always. But speaking to Mariana's context in Bulgaria, and it's a great opportunity to finally have the chance to work in university, but we also know that human rights is politicized, right? And it's sometimes associated with one political party and not another. And those have implications for curriculum policy as well as work at university. So would anyone else like to address?
If you are talking about multiple volunteers and protests, if you look at the refugee issues, if you open up the Dutch newspapers or you watch the news, it seems like nobody is. Some people are against, mostly, and it's quite negative. But what we see is also that there is support. If you see the initiatives that come from communities, but also from companies. And of course, I'm not going to lie about that. I will admit it now, most of it is also caused by the Ukrainians who are coming here to the Netherlands. But if you also start a conversation and broaden it, that you say, cannot the solidarity that you show also be broadened towards other refugees, the conversation is open. So I think also it's a way how to motivate people and engage with them. And there is more support for human rights and also for refugees than we think. So if we only follow the media, I think we have a bad perspective of our community and the people of the Netherlands.
Hi everyone, my name is Mira Kosta. I'm Indian. I live here in Netherlands. I'm 7 years in Netherlands. So my question, I'm so impressed when you talk. So because you talk about refugees and I work with refugees in this land. So I'm working as a volunteer in the Scout centers. So my question is pertaining my work over there as a social person. I talk to refugees, foreigners about the problem, their stress, the rights they have as a human being, not as a human in general. So my question is there any more help who in the refugee camp can get from human rights? A lot of things is missing over there. People don't know their rights. They kill themselves because they believe there is no hope for tomorrow. Their rights are being neglected. Everything, no future. So majority are dying for not knowing their rights. So, and my work there is to talk to them about their stress, about their rights. So my question is, there more help in the refugees can get from human rights in order to have better life?
Yes, unfortunately, due to the integration law, the asylum system also in the Netherlands is not, I'm going to say, it's in need of improvement. And sometimes, unfortunately, depends on which country you come, you have to wait 3 to 4, 5 years before you have a verdict and stay here. So what we also see, for example, in people cannot work, they cannot study. You have the organization, it's called Vluchtelingenwerk Nederland. So they are in these camp where they stay, the refugee centers, and they help and give them the first also legal aid. So they also give them all the information that they need. But sometimes also these people they have a heavy workload. And also the station they were you work for. And unfortunately, the images on television, that's reality. We are now also into conversation with Kunstlingenberg and other institutions, how we, for example, also can enter before to give them some positivity and to help them via hybrid learning platforms to start studying Dutch, for example, in the early stage. Because you can imagine if you have traveled traumatic experiences, then you come to the Netherlands and you cannot do anything. So they say work. You cannot study, just say that. So it's really demotivating, and sometimes people, because they don't have any way out, they choose for the worst case. So yeah, it's awful. And different organizations are now also talking how to improve what's happening now, because this for a country as the Netherlands should not happen.
I think what you just said, seeing them as human, that's what human rights should provide. Because there's the whole refugee procedure and asylum procedure, and that's one thing. But whatever your status is, you're still a human being, right? So it doesn't deprive you from these basic human rights. And it took us already a long time to provide these people with we still don't, a basic shelter, basic food, etc. But I think what you're aiming for, and I admire you for that, is that you keep on seeing these people as human beings with needs and wishes and dreams and all these kind of things. And hopefully the idea of human rights and could be helpful there. But I also see indeed it's sometimes in the practice it's much more difficult to actually do that.
Okay, question. It's a little past 5. Do we have time for one more question? You'll be having your session. Okay, cool. Hi, my name is Vika. I come from Statelessness and inclusion. We focus on statelessness and those who do work on statelessness and human rights education. But my question focuses more on human rights education in Dutch universities. As I have also experienced from being a student of human rights law in the Netherlands. And I've been watching lately how universities work as a student also. And I've seen a bit of commercialization and also fast tracking of studies. So I'm wondering, especially for people that are working within academia, if it's a matter of identity in terms of how the university works and mentality. I know different universities work differently, multiple contexts, but for me, that's universities have been also sort of an arena in terms of how education is provided. So I want your reflections a little bit on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Huge topic. So, in my opinion, equality, diversity, and inclusion are there's a big tension between that agenda and representation. And the neoliberal university is pretty awful. Inside. Actually, before I started this job of I was quite skeptical. I thought, okay, equality, diversity, inclusion, that's a credo that the university uses to set itself better, to look good, whatever word you want to use for it. And so I entered quite skeptical, and there's also quite a bit of literature that's quite skeptical, for example, about the committees saying, yeah, they asked the students of color to pose nice for the picture, and then forget about it later on. I must say that so far my experience has been more positive. So there is, I think, my university, a real willingness at the highest level of student boards of the university to take this serious, and it goes further than just mouth, word to mouth. They are willing to actually take action, but it is important that people who know what they're talking about are setting the policy makers.
this is the action should be taken, because so far people at the highest levels of university are not necessarily themselves very experienced with they haven't suffered much exclusion in their lives so far. So it's very important that from the bottom up, from just the employees and students are telling the boards what to do about it. But so yeah, I see your point. I think commercialization is a big problem here, but there is recognition of that also in boards, and there is some willingness to do good. So then let's tell them what to do and make use of this opportunity. We now have a between the board, so let's open it. Anything else?
Then I'd like to close our event and everyone for refugee. Be here today. There's something very interesting. Yes. Only happens in the Senate. I'm already starting here. I need to. Thank you all. We are. You. This something by the documents. We're walking over, so.
Go apart from country.
Middle Ages was treaty signed. The treaty of. Anyways, let's say that there's an anyways. Yes.
So, thing is good.
Yeah, I don't know how to turn it off.